In a quiet, run-down garage, an overweight mechanic endures the taunts of a group of arrogant bikers. They mock his size and skill, completely unaware that beneath the grease-stained overalls lies a man with a past they couldn't imagine. A retired Army Ranger sniper with a sharp mind and an even sharper set of skills. As tensions rise, secrets unravel, and their underestimation becomes their biggest mistake. What happens when the hunter reveals his true colors? Watch to find out. The midday sun bore down on the small garage tucked away on a quiet country road. The air smelled of grease, gasoline, and faintly of burned rubber. Inside, Joe, the mechanic, wiped his hands on a dirty rag. His stocky frame hunched over the open hood of an old sedan. His overalls, patched and worn, clung to his heavy build, and his salt and pepper beard framed a face that spoke of quiet endurance. Most who passed by underestimated him. He was just the overweight guy who fixed cars. But Joe liked it that way. The faint hum of the radio playing in the corner was interrupted by the sudden roar of motorcycle engines. Joe didn't flinch. His steady hands continued their work as three bikers rolled into the lot, their machines gleaming under the sun. The leader, a tall man with a tattooed neck and mirrored sunglasses, dismounted first. His swagger was unmistakable, his every move calculated to draw attention. The other two followed, their laughter loud and sharp. The leader pulled off his helmet, revealing a smirk that stretched across his face. "Hey, old man," he called out, his voice echoing in the quiet garage. "Think you can handle these beauties, or are they too much bike for your soft hands?" Joe glanced at them briefly, his expression unreadable, and then returned to the engine. "What do you need?" he asked calmly. The second biker, a wiry man with a chipped tooth, leaned against his bike. "We need these beasts running smooth, but you sure you're the guy for the job? Looks like you might pass out just bending down." The third biker, a muscular man with a scar across his cheek, chuckled. "Yeah, boss, maybe we should have gone to someone who doesn't live on donuts." The three laughed loudly, their voices filling the small garage. Joe set his wrench down and straightened up. He walked toward them, his eyes steady, his movements slow but deliberate. "I can handle it," he said evenly. "Let me take a look." The leader, Clark, sneered. "You better not mess up my ride, big guy. It's worth more than this whole shack you call a garage." Joe didn't respond. He crouched down beside the leader's bike, his practiced hands inspecting the engine. The bikers watched him, their taunts continuing. "Careful, Grandpa," the wiry one joked. "Don't break a sweat." As Joe worked silently, the garage's young assistant, Danny, peeked from behind the tool rack. Danny was barely 20 and had been working with Joe for a year. He admired Joe's patience, but today, the biker's arrogance made his blood boil. He clenched his fists, wanting to say something but holding back. Clark noticed Danny's glare and smirked. "Hey, kid, what are you staring at? You hoping to learn something from this guy? Hate to break it to you, but slow and steady doesn't win the race anymore." Danny couldn't keep quiet. "Why don't you leave him alone? He's just trying to help you." The laughter stopped abruptly. Clark turned, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Danny's flushed face. "Oh, we've got a brave one here," he said mockingly. "What are you going to do about it, kid?" Joe stood up slowly, positioning himself between Danny and the bikers. His voice was calm but firm. "Leave him out of it." Clark tilted his head, amused. "Or what, you going to sit on me?" Joe didn't respond. He simply stared at Clark, his eyes holding a quiet intensity that made the laughter fade. After a long pause, he spoke. "Your bike will be ready in 20 minutes. Clark snorted, waving him off. "Wait, whatever, just don't scratch it, big guy." As the bikers moved to the side, their laughter resumed, though quieter this time. Joe returned to the bike, his hands steady, his focus unwavering. Danny watched him, 1,000 questions racing through his mind. Joe had endured their insults without a single crack in his composure. When Joe finished the inspection, he wiped his hands and turned to Clark. "You're good to go," he said simply. Clark swung his leg over the bike, revving the engine. "Don't think this means we're impressed," he called out, smirking. "We'll be back if you messed up." Joe's gaze followed them as they roared away, the sound of their bikes fading into the distance. Danny approached cautiously. "Why do you let people talk to you like that?" he asked. Joe looked at him, a faint smile on his lips. "Because people like them always tell you exactly who they are if you give them enough time." Danny frowned, not fully understanding. But before he could ask more, the faint roar of motorcycles returned in the distance, growing louder. Joe's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned toward the sound. Something wasn't right. The roar of the motorcycles grew louder, accompanied by the shrill screech of tires. The three bikers sped into the garage's lot, but this time their faces were twisted with anger. Clark jumped off his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stormed toward Joe. "You trying to kill me, old man?" Clark shouted, his voice booming. He shoved a finger into Joe's chest. "That throttle you fixed nearly got me killed." Joe didn't flinch. His calm gaze locked on Snake's furious eyes. "What happened?" he asked evenly. "What happened?" Clark barked, his voice rising. "I was flying down the highway and the throttle jammed wide open. I almost ate the pavement, you idiot." The wiry biker, now visibly shaken, chimed in. "Yeah, man, you call yourself a mechanic? You could have killed him." Joe took a step back, his hands resting calmly at his sides. "I fixed what was wrong," he said, his tone measured. "If it jammed, it wasn't because of what I did." The burly biker, who had been silent until now, hesitated before stepping forward. "Boss," he said, his voice quieter, "maybe it wasn't the old guy's fault. You know, what we did last week?" Clark turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" The burly one looked down, scratching the back of his neck. "You told me to mess with the throttle. You said it'd make it rev louder, look cooler. Remember?" Clark's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger. "You're saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying we might have pushed it too far," the burly one muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Joe crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "So you tampered with it, didn't tell me, and now you're blaming me?" Clark spun back toward Joe, his fists clenched. "Even if we did, you should have caught it. Isn't that your job?" Danny, who had been watching from the corner, couldn't hold back any longer. "You've got some nerve," he blurted. "You come in here, act like jerks, and then blame him for your stupidity? You're lucky he even helped you." Clark's jaw tightened as he took a threatening step toward Danny. "You got a mouth on you, kid. Maybe I should—" Joe stepped between them, his broad frame blocking Clark's path. His voice was low and steady, but it carried an edge that silenced the room. "Enough. If you've got a problem, it's with me. Leave the kid out of it." Clark hesitated, his bravado faltering under Joe's piercing gaze. For the first time, the wiry biker looked nervous, glancing between Clark and Joe. "Boss," he muttered, "maybe we should just go. This isn't worth it." But before Clark could respond, the faint wail of sirens in the distance froze everyone in place. The flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared on the horizon, growing brighter by the second. Clark's anger gave way to unease. "Cops," he muttered. "Just great." The wiry biker panicked. "What do we do, boss? We can't stick around for this." Joe's calm voice cut through their panic. "You can face them or run. That's your choice." Clark glared at Joe, his fists still clenched, but the sirens were closing in fast. The burly one looked genuinely afraid, his eyes darting toward Clark. "Boss, we should just explain. Maybe we can—" "Shut up!" Clark snapped, but his confidence was clearly cracking. His gaze darted to the door, to the flashing lights now bathing the lot in red and blue. Joe took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Running doesn't fix anything. You think you're tough, but this is where it counts. Make the right call." The sirens stopped abruptly as the cruiser pulled into the lot. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts. The older of the two, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, looked straight at Clark. "Which one of you is in charge here?" the officer asked, his voice authoritative. Clark swallowed hard, glancing nervously at his crew. Joe's steady presence loomed behind them, and for a moment it seemed like Clark might make a run for it. But then he stopped, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I am," Clark muttered, his voice. Clark sighed heavily, his bravado finally broken. "Fine, let's get this over with." As the officers moved in, Joe stepped back, his expression unreadable. Danny watched in silence, his chest tight with a mix of relief and admiration. There was more to Joe than he had ever imagined, but even as the police led the bikers away, Joe's gaze lingered on Clark. Something about the way Joe looked at him, calm yet piercing, sent a chill down Danny's spine. "Joe," Danny asked cautiously, "how did you know they wouldn't run?" Joe didn't answer immediately. He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Because people like them think they're invincible," he said finally, "until someone makes them realize they're not." Danny stared at him, 1,000 questions burning in his mind, but he knew better than to push. The distant hum of engines fading into the night was the only sound as the garage fell silent once more. The garage settled into an uneasy silence after the bikers were taken away, their taunts and bravado replaced by the fading echo of sirens. Danny stood by the workbench, staring at Joe with a mix of awe and curiosity. Joe had always been quiet, methodical, and unassuming, but today had revealed something else entirely, something he couldn't quite place. Danny finally broke the silence. "Joe, you handled that like you've done it before. I mean, with those guys, and the cops. You didn't even flinch." Joe didn't look up from the tools he was cleaning. "It's not about handling them," he said simply. "It's about staying calm when others lose their heads." Danny frowned. "Yeah, but that's not normal. You didn't just stay calm, you knew exactly how to get them to fold. And the way the cop looked at you, like he recognized you or something. Who are you, Joe?" Joe's hands paused for a moment before he carefully placed a wrench back in the drawer. He turned to Danny, his expression unreadable. "You've been here a year, kid. What do you think?" Danny hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I think there's more to you than fixing cars." Joe gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before Danny could press further, the rumble of a lone motorcycle cut through the night air. Joe's gaze snapped to the open garage door, his body tensing ever so slightly. A single bike rolled into the lot, its rider cloaked in shadow under the dim light. As the engine cut off, the figure swung a leg over the bike and removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged man with a scar running down his cheek. His eyes locked on Joe immediately. "Long time, Joe," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Danny glanced between them, confused. "You know this guy?" Joe didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his demeanor shifting subtly. The quiet mechanic was gone, replaced by someone sharper, more alert. "What are you doing here, Mason?" Joe asked, his voice calm but edged with steel. Mason leaned casually against his bike, but his eyes never left Joe. "Heard about the bikers, figured you'd be in the middle of it. You always did have a way of attracting trouble." Danny's confusion deepened. "Wait, what's going on? Who is this guy?" Mason chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "The kid doesn't know, does he?" He straightened up, his gaze hardening. "You haven't told him who you really are." Joe's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Mason took a step closer, his tone turning serious. "Those bikers weren't just some punks. They're tied to something bigger, an operation that's been running guns through this area for months. And guess who's been tasked with cleaning it up?" Danny's eyes widened. "Guns? What does that have to do with Joe?" Mason smirked. "Everything. Because your quiet little mechanic here isn't just a mechanic. He's a retired Army Ranger sniper who's probably seen more action than you could ever imagine." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Danny stared at Joe, his mind racing. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Joe exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing as if a weight had been lifted. "It was a long time ago," he said finally. "Another life." Mason crossed his arms. "Well, that life just caught up with you. Those bikers weren't just harassing you for fun. They were scouting. Someone higher up sent them to check out the garage, probably because you've been flagged." Joe's eyes narrowed. "Flagged for what?" Mason's expression darkened. "For being you. Word travels in certain circles, Joe. Retired or not, people like you don't just disappear." Danny couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Joe, what does he mean? Are you in danger?" Joe glanced at Danny, his face softening slightly. "I'm fine, kid, but it looks like things are about to get complicated." Mason nodded. "More than complicated, you've got a decision to make. Either you stay out of it and let them bring their operation to your doorstep, or you help me stop it before it gets worse." Joe didn't hesitate. "I'm not letting this spill over here." Mason grinned, a glint of approval in his eyes. "That's the Joe I remember. Let's get to work." Danny stood frozen, watching as Joe and Mason began discussing strategies like it was second nature. The quiet mechanic he thought he knew was gone, replaced by someone sharper, more focused, and undeniably dangerous. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. What would you do if you found out someone you knew had a past like Joe's? Share your thoughts below. Stay tuned for more gripping tales.